Welcome to TrustTalk. Trust plays a fundamental role in international relations, shaping diplomacy, conflict resolution, and strategic decision-making. For China, with its deep historical and philosophical traditions, trust is often understood through a unique lens, one influenced by Confucian values, historical experiences, and contemporary geopolitical realities. Our guest today is Feng Zhang to explore these dynamics. He is an associate research scholar in East Asian Studies at Yale University's MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Feng, thank you for joining me today. Let's begin by discussing the historical and cultural dimensions of trust in Chinese foreign policy. How have foreign policy traditions, according to Confucianism, influenced China's approach to trust and diplomacy historically, and are these principles still relevant today?
When we look at how Confucian traditions shaped Chinese diplomacy historically, we're really examining something fascinating about relationality in international affairs. During various periods of its history, China's approach wasn't simply about power projection. It was also relational. So what I found most interesting in my research is that Chinese foreign policy operated on two distinct forms of rationality. We typically think of international relations as driven by instrumental rationality, calculating costs and benefits, maximizing self-interest. But in traditional Chinese diplomacy, there was also what I call expressive or affective rationality. Those are actions taken not just for material gain, but to express and cultivate proper relationships. So when relations are amicable, Chinese rulers were more likely to act according to Confucian ethical principles like humaneness and rightness. They weren't just being idealistic. They were actually practicing a different form of rationality that prioritized the quality of relationships. And this relational approach, I think, has direct implications for trust. A relational approach implies concern for the well-being of others. And I think it's one of the most effective ways of building trust. Is this still relevant today? I think so, although in transformed ways. I think the emphasis on relationships rather than just transactions remains influential. You can see this in China's discourse about building a community of shared future, that's the phrase they use, and in its approach to varying kinds of partnerships with other countries. One thing we do need to note about China's current foreign policy is the tension between instrumental and relational thinking. On the one hand, there's certainly self-interested calculation. There's no surprise here because every country has that. But there's also this recognition that relationships themselves have value beyond immediate gains. So the challenge for China today is balancing these two rationalities in a world that often operates on purely instrumental terms.
With the world becoming more divided and power shifting among multiple countries, can institutions like the UN still foster trust between nations, or do we need a new approach to global cooperation?
I believe we need both reformed existing institutions and new approaches to global cooperation because the current system faces significant challenges. The post-World War II international order, which has been centered around US leadership and institutions like the United Nations, is increasingly strained. I'll make a few quick points. First, the UN Security Council structure, as we know, reflects post-World War II power dynamics, and they no longer match today's reality. Permanent members wield disproportionate power, but rising powers in the global south feel marginalized. The second point is that global governance is increasingly conducted through multiple overlapping orders rather than a single monolithic system. That means different regional powers, institutions, and non-state actors all shape governance in various domains. We need to recognize that bottom-up initiatives can succeed even without great power support. There are many examples of this. In the past, we have examples of the Landmine Treaty and the responsibility to protect doctrine. So these examples show how middle powers and NGOs can drive meaningful change. So in my collaborative research with Professor Ned Lebao, we propose a combination of top-down and bottom-up reforms to global governance. We argue that great powers should exercise self-restraint and focus on global challenges like climate change, and middle and small powers should exercise their own agency and take more initiatives to shore up the international order when the great powers are becoming increasingly self-absorbed and irresponsible.
Trump's return to the presidency brings back an area of America First policies, trade wars, and increasing tensions with China. Given the trust deficits that deepened during his first term, are there any realistic steps left to rebuild US-China trust?
I think there are indeed realistic steps that could help rebuild trust between the two countries, although we should in no way underestimate the obstacles standing in the way. There are two main issues in the relationship. The first is conflict of interest, which is what most people talk about. The other issue, which Ned and I emphasize, is the framework of justice in US-China relationship. We need to consider both sets of issues and find ways to address both sets in an integrated but practical manner. So the devil is in the details, but some broad principles are clear. I'll just mention a few. The two countries should focus on what I would call a positive or benign form of competition. They could compete, but they need to acknowledge that they function as members of the shared international community. And they should pursue different pathways to status rather than a zero-sum competition for geopolitical dominance. Their competitive approaches should allow both of them to gain status without direct confrontation. So the bottom line is that trust rebuilding would require both sides to move away from maximalist positions. The path forward is challenging but not impossible if both sides can focus on practical cooperation, where interests align while managing competition elsewhere.
China claims to be a different kind of great power, focused on win-win cooperation rather than dominance. But with trade wars, European skepticism, and Trump pulling back from traditional alliances, has Beijing found an opportunity to rebuild global trust, or is the world still skeptical of China's intentions?
I'll answer yes to both of your questions, and we need to explain an underlying paradox here. China has consistently positioned itself as a different kind of great power, as a power that focused on peaceful development, harmonious relations, and win-win cooperation rather than dominance. But there is a tension in China's approach. On the one hand, China promotes its exceptional qualities as a new kind of great power, that is Chinese exceptionalism in international relations. On the other hand, there's a strong nationalist drive to reclaim what many Chinese see as their country's rightful place as a great power. So this creates a key contradiction between China's inclusivist rhetoric and its statist motivations. So I think the world's skepticism isn't simply about China's growing power. It's also about the perceived gap between China's claims and its actions in various domains, from territorial disputes to economic practice. And what's interesting is that China's exceptionalism remains largely defensive rather than offering a clear, coherent, alternative vision. It's often defined more by what it claims not to be, not hegemonic, not interventionist, for example, rather than by a well-articulated positive agenda for global governance. So for China's exceptionalist narrative to gain more global traction, it would need to move beyond vague assertions and defensive positioning. The challenge for Beijing, I think, is whether you can resolve these internal contradictions and translate its exceptionalist rhetoric into a foreign policy that genuinely reassures rather than concerns other countries. So the world, especially the West, remains skeptical, but China has a lot of agency. And if it looks hard enough, you will always be able to find opportunities to rebuild global trust. I'd say right now is an excellent moment, largely because America, under the Trump administration, is not only abandoning global leadership, but actively creating havoc on global order. So if China can exercise self-restraint in asserting its self-interest and make meaningful contributions to global governance, it will be able to rebuild trust with countries in Asia and Europe. That's not an impossible task, although it is certainly going to take some time.
Xi Jinping's Global Civilization Initiative, or GCI, promotes civilizational pluralism, rejecting the idea that Western democracy or any single ideology should dominate. But with US-China tensions escalating over trade, Taiwan and global leadership, does the GCI have any real traction, or is it just a rhetorical tool to counter the West?
I believe the GCI has potential beyond mere rhetoric, although its implementation faces serious challenges today. The GCI may have been intended in part as a rhetorical counter to the West, but I don't think that's the whole story. I think it also represents a substantive alternative vision for global order based on civilizational pluralism. What Beijing is proposing is moving away from universalist ideologies, whether Western liberalism or any singular approach, toward what might be called cultural politics, where ideological differences are localized within civilizations rather than projected globally. However, the current trajectory of US-China relations presents major obstacles, and the civilizational framing risks becoming weaponized. And what gives me pause is that the GCI currently doesn't have specific mechanisms for implementation beyond the general principles. So for it to gain traction internationally, China needs to develop a more concrete vision of how civilizational pluralism would actually operate in practice.
China presents the GCI as a model for a more inclusive post-Western global order. But after Beijing's pro-Russia stance on Ukraine and its vocal support for Palestine, does the world, especially Europe and the global South, see China as a trustworthy global leader or just another great power advancing its own agenda?
The perception of China's trustworthiness varies dramatically across different regions. When we look at Europe, China's stance on Ukraine has certainly damaged trust substantially. European leaders generally view China not as a neutral actor, but as enabling Russia's actions while claiming neutrality. This credibility gap has deepened existing tensions over trade, human rights, and other issues. In the global South, the picture is more nuanced. China's position on Palestine has resonated with many countries. They have long criticized Western double standards. And China's support for developing nations through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative has built goodwill, although this is not to deny that these countries have also voiced various concerns. And many global South nations appreciate China's emphasis on civilizational pluralism and respect for different development paths, which contrasts with Western liberal prescriptions. I should also add that the position that the Trump administration has taken toward these issues have shone a considerably more positive light on China. For example, on Ukraine, the Trump administration is basically selling out Ukraine, if you can say that. Europe is feeling betrayed, as you well know. This is probably creating a more disorienting psychological effect than China's stance toward the war. So the reality is that China, like all great powers, advances its own interests. The question isn't whether China acts in self-interest. All countries do. But whether such self-interest is enlightened or narrowly focused. I think China's vision of international order needs to offer genuine benefits to other countries alongside its own interests.
China argues that imposing values on other civilizations amounts to a form of imperialism. Do you think Western democracies and China can ever trust each other given their fundamentally different political systems?
Trust between Western democracies and China is possible, but it requires moving beyond the ideological framing that has dominated our thinking. The key insight from my collaborative work with Professor Feng Zhang on the Global Civilization Initiative is that we need to shift from universalist ideological competition toward what we call cultural politics. So what does this mean in practice? It means recognizing that political systems reflect specific historical experiences and cultural contexts. China's governance model emerged from its particular history, just as Western democratic systems evolved from theirs. The mistake both sides make is treating these differences as universal ideological contests, rather than expressions of distinct civilizational paths. And trust doesn't require similarity. It requires predictability and the recognition of legitimate difference. So if you look back during certain periods, such as the 1970s to the early 2000s, China and Western countries maintained very functional relationships despite system differences, because both sides accepted a degree of civilizational pluralism in practice, if not in rhetoric. The deterioration we've seen recently stems from both sides retreating to ideological framing. The West presents liberal democracy as the only legitimate system, and China sometimes frames its model as inherently superior. So what we need is a genuine civilizational pluralism where both sides can say, we believe in our system for ourselves, but we recognize your right to develop differently. This doesn't mean abandoning values, but really about contextualizing them within civilizational boundaries.
In 2012, Xi Jinping proposed what he called a new model of major power relations to avoid US-China conflict. Looking back, was this ever a serious commitment or just diplomatic posturing?
Looking back at that period, I believe the proposal for a new model of major power relations represented a genuine strategic vision, not merely diplomatic posturing. Ned and I have done some work on this period in our book, Taming Sino-American Rivalry, which was published in 2020. What I can say is that when Xi initially introduced this concept in 2012, China was actively searching for a framework to manage what was clearly becoming a more complex relationship with the US. This wasn't just rhetoric. It reflected a real recognition among the Chinese leadership that the traditional historical pattern of conflict between rising and established powers could be disastrous in the nuclear age. The concept had three key pillars. The first pillar is no conflict or confrontation. The second pillar is mutual respect. And the third pillar is win-win cooperation. So I think they represented China's desire to find a stable balance with America. Where things broke down was implementation, and we can talk about that if you want.
Yeah. Especially, what were the biggest missed opportunities during the Obama-Xi Jinping discussions in 2013? Could the US have done anything differently to make this model work?
The Obama-Xi meetings in 2013, particularly the Sunnyland Summit in June of that year, I think represented a promising moment of possibility in the relationship. There was some genuine momentum around building this new framework, but there were several missed opportunities. First of all, I think there was a fundamental disconnect in how each side approached the concept. The Chinese side was deeply invested in the conceptual framework, but the American side wanted concrete, practical cooperation to demonstrate the model's viability, and neither side successfully bridged this gap. I think the Americans could have engaged more seriously with the conceptual aspects that China prioritized. And meanwhile, China could have done more to deliver the practical cooperation that the US was seeking. So I think looking back, it is regrettable that they haven't been able to do more. to make this model a working reality.
In 2013, China's sudden announcement of the Air Defense Identification Zone, or ADIZ, over the East China Sea took the US by surprise. Can you briefly explain what this move signified, and do you think that it was a deliberate challenge to diplomatic trust or simply a strategic miscalculation?
Yeah, sure. I think it represented a big miscalculation. And the decision came at precisely the wrong moment. Earlier that year, Xi and Obama had their productive Sunnyland summit, and we were seeing real momentum toward building this new model of major power relations. And then, just as American officials wanted to operationalize this concept, China announced the Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ, with virtually no warning to the US. And what's particularly revealing is that this appears to have been primarily driven by the People's Liberation Army, the military's organizational interests, rather than a coordinated diplomatic strategy. And the announcement proved very counterproductive. It damaged the new model diplomacy and gave the US stronger arguments for extending security guarantees over disputed territories.
A year later, in 2014, Washington stopped taking the new model seriously. Was there a specific event or a decision that irreversibly damaged trust in the framework? By 2017, the Trump administration officially abandoned engagement and labeled China a competitor. In hindsight, was this shift necessary or an overreaction?
I think it's clear that there was a major turning point in late 2013 that severely damaged the trust in the relationship. The ADIZ announcement that we have been discussing, that took place in November 2013, was the first incident that damaged the promising diplomatic momentum. This came just 3 days, this interesting fact, that this came just 3 days after US National Security Advisor Susan Rice had given a speech endorsing the new model concept. And the ADIZ announcement was followed by China's island building campaign in the South China Sea. That began in September 2013. And that further convinced Washington that Beijing's actions contradicted its cooperative rhetoric. Was Trump's shift to competition necessary or an overreaction? The evidence suggests some kind of course correction for US-China relations was widely expected in Washington. That was because by 2017, the pattern of Chinese actions had turned domestic American opinions against business as usual. Many people would favor a new approach with more competitive elements, but without abandoning engagement. The Trump administration, the first Trump administration, went straight to the highly competitive end of the spectrum, and its strategy consequently lacked nuance and proportion. So in essence, the shift to competition reflected genuine problems in the relationship. But Trump's implementation sacrificed strategic wisdom for tactical confrontation. And this damaged prospects for the kind of positive competition that could have stabilized the relationship.
With deepening US-China rivalry and a world increasingly divided along geopolitical lines, do you still see a path toward genuine trust and cooperation, or are we locked into an area of permanent competition?
Well, there's always hope, and it's especially important to maintain hope in these dark times. We're not going to return to the optimistic engagement era of the 1990s to the 2000s, but we're not locked into a Cold War-style permanent confrontation. What I hope to see is a scenario of managed competition alongside selective cooperation on shared challenges. So I think we should develop a nuanced picture rather than an either-or scenario. Deep competition exists and will likely continue, but there are still pathways for managing this rivalry constructively rather than destructively. This is a central theme in my collaborative research with Professors Ned Labow and Barry Bazan. Ned and I, for example, suggest concrete ways to manage Sino-American conflict through the principles of justice. We emphasize the quest for status as a root cause of US-China competition. And we suggest that status competition can be managed by creating different pathways to status rather than zero-sum rivalry. And Barry and I argue that it's possible to shape the nature of competition. China faces choices between narrow self-interest and broader system-wide responsibility. And we suggest that China pursue what we call consensual pluralism by easing contested elements in relations with the US, by adopting consistent reassurance toward its Asian neighbors, and by developing system-wide responsibility in its approach to regional and global issues. I think it's also important to note that the prospects for trust building are stronger in specific domains rather than across the entire relationship. Climate change, pandemic prevention, financial stability, and nuclear arms control are areas where shared interests might enable cooperation despite broader competition. So I'll wrap up by saying that what's required is a clear-eyed recognition from both the American and Chinese leadership that even though strategic competition will persist, both sides can still choose whether to pursue constructive or destructive forms of competition.
Feng, we've come to the end of our interview. I understand that you are writing a new book. It's coming out soon. It's called History Lessons, Analogies, Learning from Wars and Pandemics. When is this book coming out?
Oh, it's a co-author book with Ned also. We hope it'll come out by the end of this year.
Well, Feng, thank you very much for being our guest today and your insights. I wish you all the best and good luck with finishing your book. And thanks for being available.
Oh, thank you too.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Trust Talk. We hope today's conversation inspired new insights into the transformative power of trust. At Trust Talk, we're committed to exploring trust's role in shaping a better world, one story at a time. If our mission resonates with you, we invite you to support us. Your donation, no matter the size, helps us continue these meaningful conversations. Visit us at trusttalk.co/donate to contribute and be part of this journey. Thank you for listening and being part of the Trust Talk community. We can't wait to have you join us again for the next episode.